So just like that, we are live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We are so excited to have you with us. Welcome to Learn Live. My name is Jacques Guibert. You can call me Jack. I'm also joined by a wonderful presenter. Erica, would like you to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Erica, and I'm a product manager with Azure Virtual Networking. So glad to be here with Jacques, and we're excited to talk about today's session with you.
Thank you, Erica. Appreciate you being with us here. Also, we are joined by a wonderful Rahman, who is our moderator. Feel free to say hi to him in the chat. He is excited to be with us as well. We are very excited. We have a great agenda for you today. Let's look over what we're going to look at. First, feel free to follow us along in the Learn Live module. Learning path is listed there. You are welcome to use the QR code on the bottom of the actual screen there. If you don't feel comfortable, you are welcome to type it out, which is all listed there with aka.ms/learnlive-2023011-2A. Give you a second to do that, and then we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. All right, feel free again to interact with us through the actual comments section. Again, Rahman will actually look over. He's our moderator. He will pass on those questions to us. Thank you for doing that, Rahman. Very excited to have you with us as well. Today we're going to talk about creating an Azure virtual network. We're going to talk about creating Azure VPN gateways. And of course, we're going to learn how to work with Azure ExpressRoute, which is really cool. So first, we need to understand the scenario, and we're going to present the scenario for you so that it's easier for us to understand how that relates to real life. Now, suppose that you work as a network architect in a global pharmaceutical company. This company has a bunch of intellectual property. They work on sequencing genes to create formula for proprietary and commercial and confidential medicines. And so these workloads need to be hosted in a hybrid environment. So Azure Manager is tasking you to connect these networks on premises to the Azure cloud or to other types of workloads. So that is the actual scenario that we're going to use today. Now, let's talk about Azure Virtual Networking. Now, the cool thing about this is that it really brings a lot of services together. Now, Erica, you've probably used Azure Virtual Networking before. Can you connect pretty much any service in Azure with Azure Virtual Networking?
Yes, so Azure Virtual Networks, it's a very dynamic resource. So here's a list of some of the functions that are covered through this, the VNets, what we call it. So I agree. I think there's various ways and configurations that you can connect both your on-prem and also your Azure resources together.
Absolutely, yeah. And so some of our customers might say, hey, I need to know how to isolate my network traffic. Is that something we can do in Azure? Isolate traffic? We can, right? Can't we?
Yes.
Yeah. And in segmentation and topologies, of course, that also plays into what we do as well. So I think it sounds like we could do a lot if we know how all that plays together. So I'm pretty excited about this stuff. What about, can you communicate workloads to the internet or privately? Is that also possible? Sure,
Yes.
okay. What about between Azure resources? Is that also pretty easy to do, or is there a lot of things to configure?
I would say it's pretty easy to do, and we're going to walk through an exercise today to show you exactly how to do it.
Excellent. So excited, so excited. Of course, we want to make sure that we have a hybrid-centric or hybrid mindset. So communicating on premises, I'm assuming, is something that we definitely want to make sure that everybody is able to do. So that's actually pretty exciting as well. Of course, we also want to keep in mind how we route traffic and how we filter it, as well as how we can connect virtual networks together. So this is going to be a lot of great topics that we're going to discuss. Can't wait. All right, so segmentation. Now, Erica, you mentioned that we can segment. Are there specific topologies that we recommend that would help our customers to have better segmentation of their networks?
So for Azure, we do recommend a topology, which we call the hub and spoke model. And I think we can see it illustrated here if we look a little bit deeper. So Jacques, would you like to talk us through what we're looking at here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Erica. So on the left, as Erica mentioned, this is called a hub and spoke model. We have the on-premises network. This is what we have been using for years, right? We're very accustomed to this. We know how it works. But on the center, you have your hub. And at the center, you will notice there is one gateway over here and another gateway VPN device that allows us to connect these two networks together in a secure manner with basically a VPN tunnel. On the far right, we have a variety of spokes, and these spokes are going to filter their traffic through the hub before they get back on premises or back to the other spokes. So this topology is really, really helpful for security because at the center of your spoke, you have a network virtual appliance like an Azure firewall, which is an enterprise-grade firewall system that we provide in Azure, which is going to allow us to inspect the traffic as it comes through back and forth, depending on which SKU you choose. And of course, if you need any type of management, we also have this wonderful service, which is a platform as a service called Azure Bastion. And this is a little bit beyond the scope of what we do for this training, but it basically allows you to communicate to virtual machines in a secure manner without opening RDP ports and SSH. Now, the other thing I want to ask you, Erica, when we talk about ingress and egress, does that mean that we have opportunities to tune Azure services to decide how traffic is flowing in and out of networks?
Yes, there are resources that allow us to control the traffic flow coming in and coming out of our network. So yeah, I'm really excited to dig into those shortly in this presentation.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, me too. So here are some capabilities that we need to know. When we build virtual machines in Azure, I've been told that it is connected to the internet by default. But Erica, keep me honest here. Don't we have abilities to also change those defaults to make sure that we don't have virtual machines on the internet?
Yes, that is true. So Azure is very committed to security. So we do have a variety of options that folks can use and integrate into their networks. Some of them are listed here. I would say pointing out one, and specifically network security groups allow you to configure certain rules and policies for your networks. That's something that's very near and dear to my heart. But we also have Azure Firewall, Azure Route Tables, as well as Azure Policies. So many ways that you can protect your network on different layers.
I see. And keep me honest, your network security groups, Azure Policy, those are part of your subscription. There is no additional cost for these configurations, correct?
Yep.
Excellent, excellent. And then if a customer wanted something even more fine granular, that's where they would use something like Azure Firewall, where it's an enterprise-grade premium service, which gives them even more control over how things are flowing in and out of their network. Okay, excellent. Well, I think I got this. And of course, we do have partner products that can be used as well. Those are obviously available in the marketplace as well.
And Jacques, for our listeners here, can you describe what an NVA is?
Oh, thank you. NVA stands for Network Virtual Appliance. It's a category of a network virtual device that you can host on Azure. So for example, maybe you use a specific partner product that you like on premises. You could probably use that same partner product or a similar product inside of Azure. So you don't have to necessarily use Azure Firewall, but you can use some sort of network virtual appliance that is similar to a network, Azure Firewall to do similar type of functionality. Thank you for the question. All right, so as we said, we have a link on an overview of Azure Virtual Networks. We're going to paste that link in the chat from how to configure the virtual network, and how that works. But we're going to also break down, while we paste that link in the chat, we're going to break down how all this plays together. First, we need to understand that virtual networks, if you don't have one already deployed and you're deploying a virtual machine, Azure will do it for you. It's actually really convenient. So if you have a blank subscription and you have no networks defined, when you deploy a virtual machine, Azure will create one for you. Okay. Now we'll have some of the defaults enabled for you until someone goes into the Azure policy to change those defaults. Things like, for example, not exposing RDP ports or SSH ports on the internet. That's one of those actual Azure policies that your administrators could enable to prevent those types of activities. Now, Erica, on the virtual networks, can you create a virtual network without a subnet?
No. So that's one of the parts of the exercise we'll work through today is that we'll be able to look at how you create a virtual network. And within your configurations, they'll ask you to create your subnets and put in your configurations for those as well.
Excellent. Okay, so it sounds like that's one of those dependencies. And can you create more than one virtual network, I'm assuming?
Yes, you can.
Oh, excellent.
But I think it's important to call out that a virtual network can only live within one subscription within one region.
Oh, that's good to know. But we can deploy another virtual network basically in another subscription or another region if we wanted to, but it would not be the same virtual network. Is that correct?
That's correct. But there are ways to connect them, and I'm excited that we'll be learning how to do that as well.
Excellent. I love this. I love this. Okay. So we also have something called service endpoints. And so these service endpoints obviously has some capabilities to allow, and this is something I've been told, and I've been using them too, is it allows resources to use the Azure backbone to communicate between services and networks. So Erica, do those service endpoints, is it easy to configure inside our virtual networks, or is it really a hard task to do?
It is fairly simple to do. I think it's very convenient for you to be able to connect your Azure SQL databases or other storage accounts using these service endpoints. So it's a really great function to take advantage of when you are setting up your virtual network.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And is there a cost for service endpoints? Do we have to pay any costs for that?
Nope, there's zero cost.
Excellent. I love it. I love it. Now, we also have something called private endpoints. Now, I hear these are really popular with our customers. What exactly do private endpoints do for us?
So private endpoints, they're a network interface, and they use your private IP address from your virtual network. So this network interface connects you privately and securely to a service that's powered by Azure Private Link.
Excellent. Excellent. So it sounds like I could potentially pinpoint a specific service or resource in Azure and provide direct link to it through a private endpoint. This could be huge. I mean, I could potentially allow my partners or allow a sister company to help us collaborate together with private endpoints. I mean, the options are limitless here. I mean, that's pretty cool. Now, I wanted to ask also, in the private endpoint, I'm assuming you have to enable it on both sides, right? You have to have some sort of private endpoint link that you provide to the provider, or how does that work? Do you know off the top of your head?
So when you do enable a private endpoint, you are bringing the service into your virtual network. So through that configuration, yes.
Oh, very cool, very cool. And we have control as a customer. We have control over that. We can decide when to stop exposing that when it's no longer appropriate, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Very cool, very cool. Okay, well, now we can obviously have hybrid methodologies in Azure, and it sounds like there are a lot of different options from a network perspective, but often our customers ask us, can we bring Azure and the on-premises environment, and can they communicate effectively? Are there options for that for our customers?
Yes, there are. And there are three options, depending on what your situation is in your environment. And I think if we look deeply into that, Jacques, can you talk us through what exactly we're looking at here?
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like we have a VPN gateway right over here. And then we have two on-premises data centers that are basically have a series of VPN tunnels, site to site most likely, to be able to essentially encrypt the traffic from on-premises to our subscription in Azure. And so this is one of our options that we have available that Erica was just mentioning, is having that VPN gateway be able to communicate appropriately. And we're going to talk about this later on, don't worry, it's coming, where we have the effective way to be able to set up more than just just one VPN connection. So if you have multiple data centers inside different areas of the world, you can establish those private connections very effectively. It's really, really easy to do. Now, one thing I also love, and people ask us about this all the time, especially for troubleshooting, is how do I get visibility on this connectivity? And there's a great tool inside of Azure called Azure Network Watcher. It is part of your subscription. It allows you to have a topology view of what you're doing. It gives you a great in-depth understanding of packet capturing if you need it, maybe some troubleshooting between connections of resources. I cannot downplay how useful this tool is. And I can tell you that every subscription has it. It's really nice. So I highly advise anybody who's doing troubleshooting or understanding how their topology is set up, use Azure Network Watcher inside your subscription.
Shak, I have a question before we move on. So this illustration that you're providing here, is this an example of point-to-site VPN or a site-to-site VPN?
So great question. Point-to-site typically is associated with an individual user to a site, hence the point-to-site. Site-to-site means that you have a large data center or a large facility, or you're on the edge and you're trying to connect that actual facility to another big facility. And that's what we call site-to-site VPN. So great question. All right, and so this is basically what we just talked about, where that point-to-site is going to allow an individual user, and in the age of COVID, people used this quite a bit, right? Because people did not have enough capacity on premises. So they basically expanded their infrastructure from on-premises to clouds, including Azure, where users were able to work from home, connect via VPN, and often was through Azure, and they use this point-to-site connection. It's really nice. It works really well. Okay. In fact, there is an exercise that is inside the learning path that teaches you how to create these. So you will have an opportunity to do this on your own. It's really nice. The second option here is the site-to-site VPN network we have here. And that's what I just mentioned earlier. And this allows you to have enterprise-grade type of gateways on each end, setting up a tunnel in between so that it's encrypted and therefore the traffic can flow nicely. Okay. And lastly, if you really need throughput, and this is one of our favorites, it is the ExpressRoute. ExpressRoute is wonderful because it has low latency, high speeds. I mean, you're looking for really, really big throughputs. And this product will pay for itself, especially if you have mission critical applications that you're hosting in the cloud. Now, Erica, you've probably seen customers with Azure ExpressRoute. What do you think have they given you any feedback on how ExpressRoute works for them?
I think it's the ability to have connectivity that's dedicated for their own use is a really big benefit of implementing Azure ExpressRoute into their networking configurations, because especially companies that deal with a lot of sensitive data, they may not want their information and data traveling over the internet. So they choose to implement a solution like Azure ExpressRoute to have more control over that.
That is huge. Did you say private? That means that it doesn't go over the internet? That's actually a really big deal.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really cool. And so do they have to work with their ISP to get that, or internet service provider to get that? Or how does that usually work? Do you know?
So Azure has partners that we work with. And Jacques, you may be more familiar with this process a little bit more. So they're able to configure an actual connection through our ISP partners.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the customers I've talked to, they basically work with their ISPs and us, Microsoft, to be able to establish these connections. And so they've basically said that it's really, really fast, and it's redundant too. So if there is a fiber cut, they still have a second medium to be able to provide them connectivity. And so if you have mission critical applications hosted in multiple clouds in Azure, this is very helpful for them to be able to extend their on-premises networks into clouds. So highly, highly recommend, especially if you're using Azure for mission critical applications. Thank you, Erica. All right, now routing. Let's talk about routing, because we can't talk about networks without routing, right? Please understand that Azure uses BGP. right? BGP is the Border Gateway Protocol. It is basically I think it's an open standard, honestly, and it is basically going to allow the different routers to advertise their routes to neighbor routers, right? And it's used extensively on the internet, and in Azure, we use it extensively as well. Now, we have a couple things inside of Azure. System routes. System routes is used by default, which means that if Erica and I build a virtual machine in Azure and we want to talk to each other and it's on the same subnet, it just will work. It's just magical, right? But from a security standpoint, that might not necessarily be a good idea. And so we do have the capability of overriding those routes with user-defined routes. Erica, in the user-defined route space, is it pretty easy to set up a static route to potentially an appliance or terminate it or send it to the internet? Is that something we can do with user-defined routes?
Mm-hmm. That's something that is a capability with UDRs.
Excellent, excellent. And is there pretty much pretty easy to do? I'm assuming it's pretty easy to implement, right? I mean, you just create one or a route table. Is that how that works?
It is pretty easily to implement, and then we have lots of documentation on MS Docs and MS Learn to help you configure your user-defined routes with Azure's default.
Fantastic, fantastic. I love that. Okay, now in the routing space, I'm assuming we can also set up gateways and so on and so forth. So I think that's pretty easy to do. We'll probably show a little bit this in the exercise, folks, so don't worry, it's going to come up. And how that works a little bit. Now let's transition to the filtering of network traffic. Now, Erica was mentioning that she loves NSGs. And Erica, can you give us a little bit more on what NSGs basically, where can you apply them? And are they basically little devices or are they a service? How does that all play together, if you don't mind, please?
Sure. So NSGs are network security groups. They're a type of construct that that is within Azure. And you can see here that we have other availabilities as well, like application security groups. But NSGs, you can apply them to your subnets or virtual networks, and that allows you to be able to control the different types of rules that that would allow your network to have incoming traffic or sending traffic over to the internet.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I was told also now, instead of memorizing the ports, we actually have the service name that is mapped to the port. That's pretty cool. I mean, that's been recent change, hasn't it?
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So the days of me memorizing the port number for RDP 3389, I don't really have to do that anymore. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think when we look at the exercise, we'll see that they'll be mapped to the names of the port. 3389, I believe, is RDP. Or so yeah, it's really easy to use. And then there are also some ports that that are connected to Azure services, so you don't have to kind of figure that out on your own either.
Oh, that's fantastic. So basically, in theory, you don't have to be a network genius to configure an NSG. You just need to know from where to where you want to send traffic, and you can just make it work.
Yeah, and that all depends on the customer's configuration and how they want their traffic to flow. So NSGs provide a lot of flexibility for that.
Fantastic, fantastic. And I think NSGs could be assigned to a virtual NIC and to a subnet, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. All right, and so we talked a little bit about network virtual appliances before, where we have the ability to use partner products, we can use Azure Firewall, and we can use potentially other types of capabilities to be implemented on the perimeter and in the subnets. I'm assuming there is a ton of partner products in the marketplace that you can find to be able to implement these NVAs, right? I mean, there's always a constant updated list of these products, right, in the marketplace?
Yeah, there are.
And so we partner with these products or these partners constantly to update them. So again, if people want to use their own NVA product, partner product, they're welcome to do so. But of course, we have our own, which is Azure Firewall, which is what we recommend, which provides quite a bit of security in the perimeter. Lastly, we have this ASG, this application security group. Now, I was told that this is really cool because it allows us to group like-minded workloads and to basically plug them into network security groups. So if I have a series of web servers, and instead of me adding each individual web server to the NSG, I can add it to the ASG and then add the ASG to the NSG. I know it's a mouthful there. So do you feel, or do you think that ASGs is a really helpful service for our developers out there?
Totally. And I think ASGs allow you to configure these network configurations at the application level. So it provides a little bit more flexibility and control based on different resources that you use to power your applications.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, that sounds really wonderful. Excellent, excellent. Now, you mentioned before that we had the ability to connect two networks together. Now, I've noticed here it says network peering. Is this easy to do? Do I have to understand how routers work and set up a routing table, or how do I do that?
So it's fairly simple. I think on the portal, you should be able to create your virtual networks and then peer them together and then create your own VMs or other resources that you would like to live in those virtual networks. But the concept of peering is very interesting as well. And I'm wondering, Jock, if we can talk through that, especially since it seems like there's different ways that we have mentioned here on how you can connect your virtual networks. So we'd probably be great to understand what the differences are between them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Erica. So as you said, there's different ones. One is global virtual network peering. And I think based on what I know, this allows us to potentially connect networks that are not in the same region. So that means if I am in US East and I want to connect a network all the way to the West US, I can potentially set up a network peer, and then I can decide whether or not it's transitive traffic going back and forth, or one-way traffic, or the other way traffic. So it sounds like I can really do a lot of connecting here with very minimal configurations.
And that's important to note is, as we mentioned earlier, virtual networks can only be created in one subscription and in one region. So if you have multiple virtual networks across various regions, that's where you would use global virtual network peering.
Excellent, excellent. Well, man, I'm very excited about this. I know our customers will be very excited, like, hey, I have all these networks, all these regions, I want to connect to them. Well, it sounds like with global virtual network peering, we could do this really well, and it sounds like it's not that hard. So I'm looking forward to that too. And then we also have service chaining, right? And so service chaining is interesting because this is basically enables us to direct traffic from one virtual network to a virtual appliance or a gateway in a peer network through user-defined routes. And that's basically when we bring together the UDR capability and peering, which is really, really nice. So very cool. Now, creating a virtual network, this is interesting because in Azure, it actually is a service. So you can actually look it up in the service. I'll show this to you guys later on. And it sounds like we can define the space of the virtual network and the subnet, right? So right here on the top here, it's asking me a CIDR notation of how big my virtual network should be. And down here, it gives me the location that I want to choose. And a little bit below is that subnet that you, Erica, mentioned earlier, that we cannot create one without defining this. So it sounds like we could probably create this pretty easily. On average, it sounds like it probably would take a minute or two, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, as fast as you can type, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we don't talk a little bit about DDoS here, but DDoS is also the ability to protect your networks for denial service or distributed denial service. We have two SKUs here. We have the basic and the standard. So those are also available to us. We're going to do an exercise later on with CLI, Cloud Shell, to be able to build this. So don't worry, you will definitely witness that.
And Jacques, before we move on, can
Yes.
we just quickly define the 3 different ways that Azure Virtual Networks can be configured? Because we have the portal, we have PowerShell, there's Azure Cloud Shell. What are the differences and why would one pick one over the other?
Great question, Erica. So if a customer is used to using infrastructure as code, they can use Cloud Shell or Azure CLI, which is essentially PowerShell or Azure CLI. They can also use a CI/CD pipeline to be able to actually deploy that via REST API through Azure DevOps or through Terraform or Bicep or Ansible or some automation tool that you might be able to leverage. And so that is very common for our customers, where they use infrastructure as code to deploy resources like virtual networks and resources and so on and so forth, and application code on top of it to be able to have a repeatable and a reliable infrastructure. The other aspect of this is you can also use the Azure portal, where you go through a graphical user interface. It shows you every selection that you have to have, and then it submits that to the ARM, which is the heart of Azure, the Azure Resource Manager, through a JSON template. And that JSON template will deploy the actual service. And then lastly, you can also use Cloud Shell. Cloud Shell is built in to multiple products, and there is also Cloud Shell directly in the Azure portal as well. So those are the three main ways that people can deploy resources.
Thank you.
Very much. All right. So while you deploy a network, you obviously want to have a unique name in the subscription. This is a constraint. Please remember that. When you deploy a subnet, you will also have to define a network that is inside your virtual network. Okay? A subnet is not an object inside of Azure. It's actually a subcomponent of a virtual network. And you have to remember that 5 IP addresses are reserved by Azure. So even though you do a /24 for 255 or 256 IP addresses, in theory, you will get closer to 251 IP addresses available because Azure reserves 5 IPs. Okay, so please remember that. That's actually very, very important. Now, last thing I'd like to mention is that you can also change your mind. So if you deploy a virtual network and say, you know what, the IP address scheme is too small, I need it to make it bigger, don't worry. You can go back into the virtual network, change the actual IPs or add the different IP addresses for your virtual network, and you can also change your subnets. Just be careful when you change subnets, because if you have a Azure resource tied to that subnet, you might create an outage, or Azure might not let you change that because there is already a resource on that subnet. Erica, is there anything else you'd like to add on this slide?
I think that's a good call out, is that you can create subnets after the virtual network is created, and just the flexibility, but also the precautions that you mentioned. I'm someone that's indecisive, so it's good to have that ability to configure things as I start to learn about what I'm trying to build in my network.
Yeah, I mean, I was that person too when I started using Azure. I was thinking, oh man, this virtual network is going to be so big. And it turns out it was so small. I had to grow that network after I deployed it. I've been there. I know exactly how that works. So yeah, it's a very nice feature that we have here. All right, so dependencies to deploy network. Erica mentioned this multiple times, which is cool. So you need a subscription. Okay, this is basically a established method of payment for your resources. Okay. Below that, you have to have something called a resource group. A resource group essentially allows you to deploy resources. A resource is, for example, a virtual network. That is a resource. A virtual machine is a resource. All of those must be tied or attached to one resource group, not 5, not 6, not 10, just one resource group. And that resource group can have resources in different regions. It doesn't have to be the same region if you don't want to, but it must be tied to a resource group. Please remember that. In addition, resource groups do not cost you any money. It's part of your subscription. Okay, you can create a lot of them, and you can use something called tags. Highly recommend it, especially for compliance reasons. It makes your life so much easier. Okay. You can have 50 tags per resource. Highly recommended. Okay. Also, please understand that a resource group must be tied to a region. There has to be a region, and that region must allow to have that resource. Now, we are trying diligently to make sure that we have parity with all resources for every region, but there are some small discrepancies. You need to know this if you are going to use Azure extensively. There's a huge list of what we have available per region and what are the actual estimated costs. You can use the Azure pricing calculator for that. And you can also look at the availabilities that we have in every region. And then lastly, if you want to create a subnet, you must actually create a virtual network first, which is really important. Erica, is there anything else you'd like to add before we move on to the next section?
So I don't have anything to add, but I see that we have a question from the audience, and this is coming from Ashish. And this question is, how can we connect to Azure VMs via RDP from a Citrix VDI using private IP? And Ashish says, I know Bastion is one option, but is there any other option?
Yes, there is. So what you can do is that basically, if you are building a virtual machine inside of Azure, you have the option to enable RDP access to a specific block of IP addresses, targeted internet access basically, so that you don't expose it to the wide internet. So even though it's still connected to the internet, it only allows that RDP traffic to a specific block of IPs or a specific IP. So if you're using a partner product like Citrix, right, and you want to basically establish that RDP connection, you need to know from one end, which is the target or the source, and then the other end, and you want to configure your network security groups to allow that traffic properly. Now, there's other ways too you can do this. You can establish a site-to-site connection between your VDI environment in Azure so that you can connect via that tunnel, so that's all internal traffic, if you want to say it that way, and you never actually expose your virtual machines to the internet. Erica, is there something else you'd like to add for that question?
No, I think you covered it.
Thank you. And thank you, Ashish, for the question. All right, so DDoS. DDoS, we have a couple options. Just know that by default, we do have some basic protections for DDoS, okay? And DDoS basically is still a crude manner for adversaries to attack your networks. It's still very much alive. It's been around for many years, and it's getting more and more complex. Just know that if you go to the standard SKU, you get even additional protections, which is very, very attractive for customers that are basically hosting mission-critical applications. So if the criticality of your application warrants it, please consider using DDoS standard, especially if you have externally facing resources, because there's a lot of adversaries, a lot of bad people will try to bring down your service if you don't have the proper protections. Okay. And then lastly, we have something called service endpoints. Service endpoints are actually really convenient. This allows our customers to potentially enable traffic for well-established services that we have inside of Azure to go behind on the Azure backbone and up back into your virtual machine networks and subnets without opening ports outside to the internet or without having fancy gateway translation activities. It is very convenient. We have a huge list of services that support this. It is built inside of Azure. It works really well. Customers really enjoy it. Okay. Anything else, Erica, would you like to add for this?
No, this is a really great run through of what configurations are needed to create your virtual network. So I think we are almost ready to get started on that, right?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. So let me see if I can bring up my Azure portal. Here it is. You should be able to see my Azure portal. And inside my Azure portal, if I just type in VNet, virtual network, you can type in also virtual network. There you go. And once I get to this page, I can click Create. Now, our exercise is going to do this via command line. So I'll show this to you later on as well. Don't worry, you will see both sides. So I'm going to use my subscription here. I'm going to create a new Learn Live resource group. It's going to validate it once it comes up. It is still processing. Give it a minute. It's validating that it's unique right now. That's what it's doing. Let me press cancel temporarily. Try my other subscription. That is odd. Yes, cancel that, please. One more time. Of course, the demo gods are making us definitely sweat a little bit here, so thank you for your patience. Let me see if I can refresh my page. No worries, I have another portal that I can bring up. So, plan B. Here is my other portal. I go to my virtual networks. I create a virtual network. I'm going to create Learn Live here. Always have a backup plan, right? In here, you just put in a unique virtual network. So let's call this my virtual network. I'm going to use East US as my region. Okay. Or East US. There we go. Next, it's going to ask me for the IP address. Now, you notice that it already has them by default. I can change this. I can say maybe I want a /15, maybe a /17, whatever feels, appropriate, right? So I'm going to do a /16. Oops, /16. I can also add another set of IPs if I want to. It's up to you. Whatever you feel comfortable. I don't need this. I'm going to leave it. Next, down here, I have the option to choose IPv6. Yes, IPv6 is very much alive, and it's available in Azure. So if you need it, it's available to you. And lastly, a subnet. You must have a subnet. So I'm going to call this sub1, and I'm going to put the same scheme of IPs. I need a 1 here, /24. And here is my service endpoints if I want to enable services to connect to my subnet. And you will notice here, I have a lot of services that I can choose. So if I want my Microsoft Azure storage to be able to go into the subnet and communicate, I can definitely do that. Okay. Add. And next, it's going to ask me about security. If I want a Bastion host, I can deploy this directly from here. If I want DDoS protection standard, if you set to disabled, this is basic, okay? So if I click enabled, it's going to allow me to select the actual DDoS protection plan. Also, if I want an Azure firewall, I can enable it here too. It'll allow me to build one. Next is tags. I love tags. Tags are amazing. You can put any value in tags. For example, a cost center. And this can be very valuable if you're doing chargeback models, for example. Review and create. It's going to validate that the JSON template that I just created through the Azure portal is valid. And when I scroll down here, it's going to submit it to the ARM for deployment. As I click create, it submits it. And as I look here, you will see that it's deploying the actual resource, which is already done. I can look at the template. It took me roughly about 73 lines of code to create this virtual network. I can copy that. I can redeploy it. I can save it to a library or even download it. Okay. And now here is my virtual network. There it is. And my subnets are literally listed here, which I can change if I want to after the fact of deployment. Okay. Pretty easy. Yep, that was my old demo. Okay, so let's go to our next section, folks. This is what we just did. We created the network. We defined those capabilities. We also created a series of resources. But now I want to show you how you create a network security group real quickly. You can type in network security group. It looks like a blue shield. There we go. Wrong subscription. There we go. I'm going to call this NSG1. Of course, you know how I feel about tags. Tags are amazing. Yes, I love tags. We should have a tag party sometime. They are fun. And they are part of your subscription. They cost you $0. So really nice. And again, once again, there's my template. I can copy this if I want to. I can harvest this information for infrastructure as code, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, lastly, I'm going to look at what it looks like. And this is my NSG. And I can tie it to my subnet by clicking on subnet right over here. And as I click on subnet, I can associate to a virtual network. There's the subnet, sub1. Click OK. And now I have a NSG attached to a subnet, and I can show it to you via something called Network Watcher. We mentioned it earlier. Let me show you what it looks like really quickly, and then we're going to move on. It's going to enumerate it. There's the Learn Live environment, and there it is. Let me collapse this. There's my NSG tied to a subnet, tied to a actual virtual network. I spent, what, 5 minutes, 10 minutes doing that? It's pretty easy. That's the beautiful thing about the cloud, guys. It really makes it so easy to deploy resources. Okay. Now, a couple other things I'd like to share with you is if I have another virtual network, I have the option to peer it. Let me show you where you find that configuration. I will not create one, but I'll show you where you can find it. If you click on the virtual network, down here, peering, can't miss it, okay? And if you click on peering, it will allow you to create a peer, and as long as you have another virtual network in your subscription, you can establish bidirectional or one direction type of communication. Very easy. As Erica mentioned, it is really kind of like magic. It does all of the routing for you behind the scenes. It's really, really convenient. Okay. All right. That is my demo. So I just showed this to you. Again, the VNets will be available to be seen in Network Watcher. I showed you a topology of that, which is very convenient. And we're getting to our knowledge check. So I invite all of you to basically put your answers in the chat for our question to see how you are following along. Hopefully you will find this test or quiz or pop quiz very easy, or maybe it's challenging and we'll be able to talk about it. Either way, we're happy to be able to answer some questions. So the question that we have is, we need to connect Azure resources like Azure Virtual Machines across geographic locations. Which Azure network options should you use? 1, A, Azure ExpressRoute, B, VPN gateways, or C, virtual network peering? Which one can it be? A, B, or C? There's no all the above. I wish there was, but no, there's no all the above. No.
So this is interesting. I'm curious to see what people are responding with.
Me too. We have 2 people voted so far. We have a couple A's, a couple C's. It's going to be interesting.
So remember, you can submit your response at https://aka.ms/polls. And please answer this question. Again, the question is, you need to connect Azure resources like Azure Virtual Machines across geographical regions. Which Azure networking option should you use? First choice is A, Azure ExpressRoute, B, VPN gateway, C, virtual network peering. So
let's see. We have about 15 people who voted. Let's see what the answer is, shall we? It is C, virtual network peering. So if you remember, Erica mentioned to us that we have the ability to bring networks together very easily through our peering capability. It's built into Azure. You don't have to do anything fancy. You just have to set up the peer on one end, and it will actually set up the peer already for you on the other end as well. It's really, really convenient. So if you've never done this before, highly recommend you test it out. You'll be pleasantly surprised. Very nice. And that goes into our exploring of our virtual network, our Azure VPN gateway. So I'm going to turn it over to Erica for her to talk about our VPN gateway capabilities. Thank you.
Hi, folks. So we're going to quickly go through Azure VPN gateways and then go into Azure ExpressRoute. So in this part of our Learn Live, we won't be doing any demonstrations, but we do encourage you to go and do them yourself because some of these exercises do take time as far as configuring configurations. But let's get started here. So when you're trying to integrate your on-premises environment with Azure, you want to make sure that you have the ability to create an encrypted connection. So you can connect over the internet, over a dedicated link. But in this module, we'll look at the Azure VPN Gateway. A benefit of this is that it provides an endpoint for incoming connections from your on-prem environment. So in this case, once you start going into the demonstration that's on the Learn module, you'd want to have set up an Azure Virtual Network and ensure that so that you can build out this VPN gateway. And the VPN gateway will ensure that any data transfers between Azure and your site and between Azure Virtual Networks are encrypted. So you also learn how to connect virtual networks between regions and subscriptions. So we briefly talked about what a VPN gateway is. And so it basically provides this endpoint for your incoming connections from on-prem to Azure using the internet. It connects network to networks over IPsec or IKE VPN tunneling. This links your VPN gateways to other VPN gateways. It also helps to connect cross-premises IPsec IKE VPN tunneling for connecting on-premises networks to Azure through dedicated VPN devices. And this creates site-to-site connections, which we mentioned earlier. And of course, point-to-site connections over IKV2 or SSTP. This will help link individual client computers to resources that are hosted in Azure.
A customer could potentially use their own VPN devices on premises to connect this methodology, correct? Or this method, correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So our customers could potentially use their own VPN devices on premises to connect to Azure in this method, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's move on here. So we did talk a little bit more about, or we did talk about point-to-site, site-to-site, and site-to-site over a dedicated network. So just a brief recap, point-to-site is when you have that individual client computer or that user that we use the example of the pandemic, people working from home trying to connect to their resources or their network using a VPN, site-to-site where we have different sites connecting together over VPN. And then lastly, we had the dedicated network option, which is the Azure ExpressRoute. Particularly Azure ExpressRoute does provide you the ability to have more bandwidth and higher levels of security because it is connecting over a private connection and not over the internet. So this is all a review from earlier. So some things you want to take a step back when you are about to design your VPN gateway configuration is, what are the areas of planning that you need to factor in? So we have a list here. You want to think about the throughput, backbone, availability of a public or static IP address, VPN device compatibility, multiple client connections or site-to-site link, VPN gateway type, Azure VPN gateway SKU. And Jacques, based on your experiences, any of these factors that you feel our customers should really think about when they are defining their VPN gateway?
Yes, most definitely. I think throughput is the biggest one, Erica, because if you basically size it too small, then you're probably going to have to build another one, or you're going to have to potentially replace the one that you created. So you want to make sure when you are designing a network and a VPN connection that you are essentially building for growth, because you will definitely have much more bandwidth than you expect. The other one also I would probably mention is how you set it up with availability. If you make it redundant or non-redundant, that's very helpful as well, especially if you're going to allow mission-critical application workloads to communicate between Azure and on-premises. You most definitely want that redundancy.
Thank you, Jacques. And I do want to share that in the Learn module, there is this table that's provided. So this can help you kind of make those decisions when you are planning. So you can see that this is separated point to site-to-site, express route. So this kind of helps you identify, the kind of benefits of each of these different options, and then you can cross-compare with your own environment. And I know this table is a little bit difficult to parse. So Jacques, anything that you want to call out on it?
Yes, I would say to the customers that are listening or to our learners is please pay attention to the actual version of the gateway and what are some of the actual limitations. One thing I would say is that you can have multiple usage of these SKUs. Find out what is best for you, maybe some load stress testing that you want to do. Maybe initially you might start small and say, hey, this is actually not good enough for us. We need to actually go to the next SKU. This is going to really help you to be able to design a robust network. The other one also I'll probably mention to you is if you're thinking about, or if you're even on the fence for ExpressRoute, you definitely want to get a gateway SKU that can support it. Back to you, Erica.
Yeah, so that's really great planning advice, especially as you configure your gateways. So this kind of reiterates what Jacques was talking about. So just making sure that you're choosing the right SKU, you're making sure you're making the decisions that allow you to configure networks in a sustainable way. So for example, as Jacques was mentioning, if you are thinking of ExpressRoute, choosing a gateway that is compatible with that is a really great option. So again, if you set your VPN gateway with the wrong one, you'll have to take it down and rebuild it, which can be time consuming for you. There is some information that's available on MS Learn about the latest information or the latest details about gateway SKUs, and that's available on MS Learn in an article. And then we do have this diagram here that should look a little familiar to us. So Jacques, wondering if you want to kind of give us a explanation of what we're looking at here.
Absolutely. So what we're seeing here, Erica, is that basically we're bringing things that we just talked about together. Peering, we're seeing VPN gateway, we're seeing a hub and spoke model. It's all we're coming together. We have an on-premises connection through the VPN gateway. We have two peering between two different other networks in the different regions. And at the center is your actual spoke, which is going to allow that traffic to be filtered, which plays into what we talked about, having a hub and spoke model for security reasons. It's pretty awesome. Back to you, Erica.
Thank you. So next, this is just a brief recap of some of the strategies or workflows that you can walk through when you are trying to connect or create a cloud connectivity strategy using VPN networking. So these are just some lists of steps that you would take. So you would want to make sure that you take the adequate amount of time to design your connectivity topology, making sure that you have address spaces available for all of your connecting networks. Create your virtual network, create a VPN gateway for the virtual network, create and configure connections to on-prem networks or other virtual networks as needed for your own environment. And then if necessary, you can create a point-to-site connection for your Azure VPN gateway. So this is a suggested workflow that we provide here. Another resource that is open to take advantage of is the designing your VPN gateways. This is a resource that Jacques, maybe you can tell us a little bit more, since I know that you've referred it to your customers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is essentially a reference document that we're about to share in the chat for you, which is essentially how you can make some pre-decisions before you start deploying. Our customers who read this article have a general idea of what they're looking for already, but this will actually answer a lot of your questions that you might already have and accelerate the decision-making process that you already have. So this is just another great resource that you have at your fingertips that is online that you can leverage and takes the guessing game out of the equation. It's pretty awesome. Back to you, Erica.
And that resource also provides different types of design plans and templates for other configurations as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You can definitely use templates, and we also have a bunch of GitHub repositories that you can use as well with reference architectures, like the Architecture Center, which is a little bit beyond the scope of this training, but those are also available because then you can use patterns and stop the anti-patterns to be deployed in your actual Azure networks.
Yep, thank you. So once you create your virtual network and you're in the activities that's on the MS Learn module, you can create the VPN gateway. So you want to make sure that you're aware of which type of VPN gateway that you'll create. This is all contingent on the type of architecture that you have. So there are two types. There's route-based and there's policy-based. I know there's a lot of text here. So Jacques, can you briefly describe what are the differences between route-based and policy-based? And if in my example, if I were configuring a point-to-site architecture model, what would I use?
So that's a good question. It depends on what you're looking for. Honestly, most customers I talk to, they really like the route-based configuration. The route-based basically is for VPN devices that have any-to-any wildcard traffic selectors. It lets routing and forwarding of tables, direct traffic from direct IPsec tunnels. It also has route-based connections that are typically built on router platforms, which each IPsec tunnel is modeled as a network interface or virtual network tunnel. The policy-based is going to be basically for devices that use a combination of prefixes from both network and the ability to define how traffic is encrypted, decrypted through the IPsec tunnel. A policy-based connection is typically built on Azure or a firewall device that performs packet filtering, for example. IPsec tunneling and decryption are added to the packet filtering and processing engine. So most customers I talk to, they typically like the route-based option.
Okay. Thanks for laying that out for us. So with that, we have another knowledge check coming up.
Woohoo!
So make sure you're ready for this. And we're going to go to the question now. So the question is, for a point-to-site Azure VPN gateway, what are the key parameters that you must specify when you create it? And the first option is A, gateway type is VPN and VPN type is route-based. B, gateway type is VPN, VPN type is route-based, and you need to specify a gateway SKU. And the last option is C, subnet is gateway subnet, and gateway type is VPN. So you have a few, maybe 30 seconds to input your answer, and you can vote for your response at https://ak.ms/polls. And we'll be closing that poll soon. So make sure you get your response in. And this one I thought was a hard question.
It can be hard, yeah. Because it's pretty detailed, isn't it?
Yeah, and I believe when I had done this module myself, I got it wrong. So I won't tell you what my answer is because, yeah, this was a really great learning opportunity for me, just to kind of understand the nuances between the different responses here.
Yeah, and so it sounds like you could definitely have a lot of different options here. I mean, it could be a subnet gateway subnet, or a gateway type is VPN, or switch the names. I mean, they are definitely making it much harder for people to see what is the proper combination here, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think the poll is still open, but I'm wondering, Jacques, if you can answer a question from the audience.
Sure.
So can you connect an Azure route-based VPN gateway to an on-premises policy-based VPN?
To my knowledge, no. I think you have to have the negotiation on both configurations to be exactly the same, to my knowledge. Again, this is based on my knowledge. So you have to have the same configuration on both ends, and you have to share the secret on both ends. Great question.
Great. So I think the poll is officially closed. And unfortunately, I can't see the responses, so I'm not sure where we landed as far as answers. But what I can do is I can show you the correct answer. So let's talk through this. And I guess I'll let you know what I picked when I had done this knowledge check. Is my initial answer was A. I guess I completely ignored the need to specify a gateway SKU. And it looks like 2/3 of our voters chose B. So I'm really glad to see that folks are learning or have this knowledge with them. So that's amazing. But Jacques, can you talk about why it's not A, why it's not C?
So we want to make sure that the answer is as complete as possible, right? So in answer B, you have the gateway type, okay, which is basically a VPN peer that we're setting up. We have the route type, which is route-based, and you also are specifying the gateway SKU. Those are the three main things that you have to basically select at the time of creation. The other answers are variants of that, which do not give you the complete answer that we're looking for. Because when you submit any type of creation inside of Azure, you must have every variable that is required filled out. Otherwise, the ARM will not deploy the resource. You have to have those actual fields filled out.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So again, I'm mentioning we're not going to go through this exercise in this module, but you're welcome to take this on your own. I think it's a really great opportunity to go through the steps, and you can see there's quite a number of them. I do want to mention that make sure you have an adequate amount of time, and by adequate, I'm thinking 45 to 60 minutes to run through the configuration of a VPN gateway. As you can see here in the Learn module itself, there's a part of the exercise that takes up to 45 minutes to complete, and that's just building the VPN gateway. That does take some time. I think I was lucky. I got it built in 25 minutes, but Jacques, I remember you said it took you about 50 minutes for that to be built.
In the East US region, which is a very active region of ours, in peak time, it was about more than 45 minutes. Yes, you are correct.
Yeah, so just make sure that you're making enough time for that, and also that you don't allow your Azure Cloud Shell to time out, because it took me at least 3 attempts and then having to run and input the code again to do that. So just some kind of tips for you when you go through that module. And again, you can also configure the gateway through the portal view. And then we have here, you can quickly use that search option to look at virtual network gateway, and then allow yourself to click on that and then be able to build it that way. However, do want to note that in the module itself, we do use a Cloud Shell in order to build that. So just as a brief wrap up, so Azure VPN gateways, they're component in Azure networks that enable point-to-site, site-to-site, and network-to-network connections. Azure VPN gateways, they enable individual client computers, which is your point-to-site to connect to resources in Azure, extend on-premises networks into Azure, so that would be your site-to-site, or facilitate connections between virtual networks in different regions and subscriptions. And that would be through network-to-network connections. And of course, we learned about virtual network peering, which allows you to connect virtual networks across the virtual networks. Great. So we have an idea of what VPN gateways are. So we're going to jump quickly into Azure ExpressRoutes. So I think here we go. We can start from here, but I think there's a really great illustration actually on the last slide that we can talk through. So Jacques, do you mind talking us through this illustration? And, I think here we just have a little blurb about the activity that's in the Learn module, but we can kind of go a little bit deeper into.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So what this illustration is showing you is essentially a very high level generic view of how things would be connected with ExpressRoute. On the very far left, you have the customer's network. And from the customer's network, you have the partner's edge, which is often an internet service provider. Okay. And honestly, you can also go to ExpressRoute Direct, which is a little bit beyond the scope of this training, which means that you have the opportunity to connect directly from your customer's networks directly to Azure without an ISP. But in this particular section that we're describing here, it does require an ISP. Your ISP will also ensure that you have redundant primary and secondary connectivity to the Microsoft Edge cloud, allowing you to have direct connections from your on-premises to other services that we provide. The benefit of this, like we said before, this traffic does not go over the internet. It is actually very, very nice for organizations that want to keep that message private. And the throughput and latency is really, really attractive for organizations that really need to accelerate their workloads in a hybrid fashion. So it provides a slew of benefits from a security, connectivity, and operational excellence perspective. Back to you, Erica.
Well, thanks, Jacques, for walking us through that. I think it's really important to just highlight those benefits. So on this slide here, we have a bunch of what Jacques had talked about as far as the benefits of using Azure ExpressRoute, as far as having faster speeds, lower latency, greater reliability, highly secure connectivity, global connectivity, dynamic routing over BGP or Border Gateway Protocol, service level agreements for connection uptime, and quality of service. So yeah, I think that's a really great run through of kind of what Azure ExpressRoute offers, as well as the benefits that the customer receives from using it in their configurations. So as far as the connectivity models, I think I'm actually on the wrong slide. So there are 3 different connectivity models. They can be Azure ExpressRoute can be connected through the following. So we have an IP VPN network, virtual cross connection through an Ethernet exchange, and point-to-point Ethernet connection. So these ExpressRoute capabilities and features are all identical across all of the above connectivity models, but are there some differences between them that we want to call out, Jacques?
Yeah, I think honestly, it depends on the ISP, but of course, you want to make sure that you are planning for growth. When I talk to customers about ExpressRoute, they start small and they say, well, we always have opportunity to go to the next tier if we need to. But the fabric or the medium that you're establishing, that's the part that you probably want to plan for growth. Once you have that in place, it's much easier for you to scale up the capabilities of ExpressRoute than for you to relay down fiber if it's needed, or some other types of connection to provide you the connections that you expect to have down the line. So always plan for growth here, especially when you're dealing with medians or connectivity between sites or your ISPs. Back to you, Erica.
And I think we have a question from the audience. So this is more connectivity, more security. Is it safe?
Great question. So more connectivity, it is safer in the ExpressRoute medium because what we're doing here is that we're not routing traffic over the internet. So in order for people to actually have access to that content, they would have to find the actual connection and try to get in the middle of those conversations from a network perspective. So that part is definitely more secure. Now, if you have site-to-site and ExpressRoute, it's actually more secure and it provides you better operational excellence, because if one of those circuits goes down, you still have your site-to-site connection or you have your redundant ExpressRoute connection. So what we see customers doing today is they have ExpressRoute and they have a backup circuit like site-to-site connection in case they have issues with that circuit, because they have such huge mission critical reliance on Azure, they can warrant that cost. Great question.
Yeah, so that's great. It really just speaks to the redundancy and the availability that these connections do provide.
Great
so question. We did talk about BGP a little bit earlier, so just a brief description of what it is. So Microsoft, we use an industry standard dynamic routing protocol. This is called BGP. And this exchange routes between on-premises network, your instances in Azure, and Microsoft public addresses. So we establish multiple BGP sessions with your network for different traffic profiles. So if you're interested in learning more about this OSI model, Layer 3 connectivity that Microsoft uses, you can check out, there's a Wikipedia article with a link that we can share in the chat, and you're welcome to learn a little bit more about that. So again, we did talk about any-to-any or IPVPN networks. These IPVPN providers, they provide connectivity between branch offices and your corporate data center over managed layer 3 connections. So with ExpressRoute, the Azure data centers appear as if they were in another branch office as opposed to somewhere else. So it's actually within your own office or your own physical structure. Anything we want to add to that?
No, I mean, it depends on most organizations. They basically rely on those branch offices, or they're very distributed. So this can be very helpful for organizations in that area. Absolutely. It's all about flexibility, honestly.
Mm-hmm. And that last connection we mentioned was that virtual cross connection through an Ethernet exchange. So if your organization is co-located with a cloud exchange facility, you can request cross connections to the Microsoft Cloud through your provider's Ethernet exchange. So these cross connections to the Microsoft Cloud can operate at either a layer 2 or layer 3 managed connections, as in the networking OSI model. So as in the BGP that we shared earlier. So we did talk about point-to-point, but this is point-to-point Ethernet connection. This provides a layer 2 or managed layer 3 connection between your on-prem data center or offices to the Microsoft Cloud. And basically, this is a really succinct description of how ExpressRoute works, but Azure ExpressRoute uses a combination of ExpressRoute circuits and routing domains to provide high bandwidth connectivity to the Microsoft Cloud. So this next image itself will kind of walk us through how ExpressRoute works as well as the circuits. So I'm going to leave it to you, Jacques, to kind of walk us through this image.
Sure. Absolutely. So what we have here again on the left is your customer on premises. Okay. Here is the customer's perimeter, where they have a lot of their core routing happening. There may be some VPN gateway capabilities. You will have to have a device that is ExpressRoute compliant. There's a huge list of customer partner products and configurations that you can actually find online, and how to be able to establish a peer ExpressRoute connection. And you will notice also we have a secondary connection because, like I said, it's redundant. We want to make sure that you have at least 2 connections, so that in case one is having a fiber outage or some sort of cut of network connectivity, that you have the option to potentially still have traffic flowing out of your network. Now, if you notice, the internet is listed on above here, and you will notice that the traffic is not going through the internet. It is private, which provides that additional level of security that customers are looking for. In addition to that, it's going to connect to a lot of our clouds, including Office 365, the Azure cloud, and the other clouds that we have as well. Okay, so it gives you a lot of flexibility from a connectivity perspective, and it helps a lot of our customers to have that low latency, high bandwidth connectivity that they're looking for hybrid networks. Back to you, Erica.
Sure. So you can see here with this red connection, that's the Microsoft peering. And then the blue, we have an Azure private peering. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into that. I think we've heard the word peering a lot now. So we just want to make sure that we don't get confused with the virtual network peerings. So Azure ExpressRoute circuits and maps to routing domains, with each ExpressRoute circuit having multiple routing domains. So these domains are the same as the 2 peerings previously listed. So we had the Azure private peering, Microsoft peering, and in an active configuration, each pair of routers would have each routing domain configured identically, thus providing high availability. So the Azure private peering names represent the IP addressing schemes. So here we have Azure private peering. This is a trusted extension of your core network into Microsoft Azure. So this way you can set up bidirectional connectivity between your core network and the virtual networks that are hosted in Azure. And this peering lets you connect to virtual machines and cloud services directly on their private IP addresses. The second peering is Microsoft peering. So we provide bidirectional connectivity between your WAN and Microsoft Cloud services through the Microsoft peering routing domains. So you have to connect your Microsoft Cloud services only over public IP addresses that are owned by you or your connectivity provider. And there are some rules that you have to make sure that you're adhering to if you are using Microsoft peering. So some of the connections that Microsoft peering supports are cloud-based SaaS offerings like Microsoft 365 or Dynamics 365. And then on the other hand, Azure provides Azure Compute services, So that private peering will connect to your compute services like your VMs and cloud services that are deployed with the virtual network. So we do have a list here that we'll share in chat to allow you to get a better understanding of the Azure ExpressRoute circuits and peering, so you can understand how to configure the right peering into your networks. So with that being said, we have a knowledge check. So just want to make sure we're ready for that. And I'm going to go ahead with the question here. And it's our favorite peering topic. So I'll read the question out loud and make sure you get your votes in to aka.ms/polls. So the question is, which peering configuration would you use for your ExpressRoute circuit where you need to allow direct connections to Azure compute resources? And your options are A, Azure Virtual Network peering, B, Azure Private peering, C, Microsoft peering. There is a lot of peering in there. So
yeah, I mean, maybe peering into the peering. I didn't see a double peering in there. But to be fair, a lot of that vocabulary comes from the industry. It's not just Microsoft coming up with these words. So if you're a network person, you know exactly what we're talking about.
And what I hear is sometimes the traditional on-premises terminology doesn't exactly translate to cloud. Have you heard that as well?
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So if there is definitely some vocabulary as you become a more hybrid-centric company, you might have to pick up some new vocabulary, what that means in Azure versus when I was on premises, for sure.
Yeah.
So we have quite a few people answering. So virtual networking peering, the other one is Microsoft peering, and an Azure private peering. So just a hint for the people who are voting, we have already mentioned this word in the answer. So if you actually see the word match, you probably got the right answer. So just give you a hint there.
It is a little tricky, though. I would say, especially if this is your first glance at the Azure virtual network space, there's a lot of, I guess, redundancy in the terminologies. But I think once you start to kind of attach these concepts to your own environment and how they work, it gets a lot easier. So, sure.
Okay, so let's see what the answer is in the interest of time. It is B, Azure Private Peering. Yeah, Erica had mentioned it earlier, and she had a wonderful slide on that. So that is exactly what you need is Azure Private Peering.
And I guess the hint here is that you're wanting to connect to your Azure compute resources. So those are resources, maybe VMs or whatnot, that you have hosted on Azure. So that's why you're connecting to the Azure private peering versus the Microsoft peering, which is more of those SaaS offerings like Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365. And then Azure Virtual Network peering, as we learned, is that's how you connect different virtual networks together. So that's how we can break that down here. So really quickly, you want to make sure that with all of your features in Microsoft Azure, that you're able to monitor them. So ExpressRoute is no different. So in order to monitor ExpressRoute connections, to ensure that they're performing satisfactorily, there are three areas of coverage that you want to make sure that you're monitoring, and that's availability, connectivity to virtual networks, and bandwidth utilization. So Jacques did mention earlier, we do have different tools for monitoring activity. One of them is the Network Performance Monitor, is a recommended one for monitoring your ExpressRoute health. And that's definitely something you want to do. You don't want to just deploy it and, hope for the best, but you want to make sure that, you have these three areas of coverage performing as expected. So with that being said, do you want to wrap up that Azure ExpressRoute? It's used to create private connections between Azure data centers and infrastructure on your premises or in a co-location environment. And Azure ExpressRoute connections don't go over the public internet. They offer more reliability, faster speeds, and lower latencies than your typical internet connections. So it does allow you to get more of that, availability and redundancy across of your networks. And one more thing is another knowledge check we have here. So this is our last one of today. So just make sure that you are plugging in their poll, and I will reveal the question. So which protocol provides dynamic routing for Azure ExpressRoute? I think we talked about this extensively. We'll give you a few more seconds to put in your polls in.
Big hint, it's a standard routing protocol. Hint, 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 hint.
And I apologize, I didn't read out the options. So it's A, IPVPN, B, Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP, or C, SKI. So, Jacques, I'm unable to see the responses come in, but
I see quite a few coming in. We'll just give it about 10 more seconds, and then we'll probably have to start doing our wrap up, Erica.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I mean, this one should be pretty clear, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. All right, tell us what is the answer, Erica.
Okay, so the answer is BGP. It's our Border Gateway Protocol.
Routing protocol. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so again, BGP is an industry standard dynamic routing protocol, and it exchanges routes between your on-prem network, your instances in Azure, and Microsoft public addresses. And we did talk extensively about this. And if you're interested in learning more, there are a few articles on MSLearn, as well as a Wikipedia article, I believe, about the model that is used. But yeah, glad to see that participation. So in summary, we had a great almost 1.5 hours together.
Yeah, time flies, right? When you have fun.
Yeah, it really does. So we introduced you folks to Azure Virtual Networks, and Jacques was able to run quickly through an exercise of how to configure them on the Azure portal. Any thoughts you want to talk about with that?
Yeah, unfortunately, we did not have enough time to show you the CLI. I wish we did. Maybe we can do a follow-up learning on this. But the exercise will be all command line interface. It's pretty straightforward. The commands are all inside the Microsoft Learn path that we shared with you at the very beginning of this class. So you have all that available to you. Back to you, Erica.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we weren't able to go through the exercises, as Jacques mentioned, in its full length, but you can definitely do them individually or get together a study group, because I find learning better with others is really fun. So we didn't get to create the Azure VPN gateway, but as I noted, it does take quite amount of time to configure that. So make sure that you do allot that amount of time and don't let your PowerShell or your Cloud Shell time out. And then we also learned a little bit about Azure ExpressRoute and which types of configurations you might want to employ and the benefits of employing Azure ExpressRoute. And also, this is just a reminder that when you do your exercise, you want to make sure that you decommission any VMs that you are working with once you're completing them. So this slide itself is just a reminder to do that and just kind of tidy up your space.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want to incur additional Azure charges. So that's the command at the bottom there that you want to use.
Yeah. So again, thank you so much, for attending this session. We really appreciated your feedback and all of your questions, and hope we were able to get to everything. Again, if you click or point to this QR code, this will take you to the Learn Live session, configure the network for your virtual machines. Very interesting, and I love how interactive it is, especially since you have already done the knowledge checks, you'll have a leg up on some of the information that's shared there. Yeah. And then I think lastly, we do want to plug in our upcoming sessions. So there's a Design Your Site Recovery Solution that's happening, I believe, next week on January 19th. So if you are up to speed with this module, we definitely encourage you to join in next week with our colleagues to learn more about, how to, create your infrastructure on Azure.
Yep.
So yeah, thank you again.
Absolutely,
Jacques,
thank you very much. And
words?
if you enjoyed, any feedback that we had during our presentation, feel free to submit the feedback. It was actually in the window. We greatly appreciate your feedback. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a fantastic rest of the day, evening, or morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.